Sarah had always imagined her marriage to Mark as the start of something beautiful. Their wedding day was perfect, and moving in with his family seemed like the right choice. His parents were warm, welcoming, and the family dinners were a spectacle, lavish feasts, full of laughter and storytelling. Her mother-in-law, Martha, seemed to go above and beyond to make her feel at home. Sarah thought she had hit the jackpot with her in-laws, unlike the horror stories she'd heard from friends. But things started to change, slowly at first. After every family dinner, Sarah would feel a strange, lingering nausea. At first, she chalked it up to being nervous or maybe even a slight food intolerance. The family's heavy meals, rich with sauces and heavy on spices, might have been too much for her stomach. She tried to ignore it, putting on a smile and pushing through the discomfort, thinking that maybe it was just in her head. After all, no one else seemed affected. Mark was perfectly fine, smiling and laughing with his family. The others continued eating without a second thought, all seemingly in perfect health. Sarah started to feel like an outsider. Everyone was enjoying these meals except her. It was as though her body was rejecting something that no one else could see. And every time she excused herself early to head to the bathroom, the concerned looks from Martha felt like little knives, twisting deeper into her growing insecurity. She didn't want to raise any alarms. How could she? Mark was close to his mother, and she was already trying to fit in with the family. Complaining about something so trivial as not feeling well after dinner seemed like a surefire way to get on Martha's bad side. Sarah had seen enough subtle competition between mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law to know she had to tread carefully. So, she kept it to herself, hiding her discomfort as best she could. But her body was not so easily fooled. The nausea persisted, and soon it was accompanied by headaches and an overwhelming sense of fatigue. It was as if the family dinners were draining the life out of her, one meal at a time. Mark didn't notice. He was busy with work, and whenever Sarah tried to hint at her discomfort, he would just shrug it off. "Maybe you're just stressed," he'd say, or, "You're probably just tired from all the wedding stuff." He didn't see the pattern emerging, the way every single meal seemed to make her worse. His nonchalance was beginning to hurt more than the sickness itself. There was a night, however, that stuck with her. As she sat at the table, sipping water and nibbling at the food, she caught a glimpse of Martha's eyes watching her closely. There was something in that gaze, something almost triumphant. It was gone in an instant, replaced by Martha's warm smile and soft words. "Are you sure you're okay, dear? You don't look too well." Sarah froze. The words seemed caring, but that gaze had said something else entirely. She nodded, brushing it off as usual, but inside, her thoughts were racing. Was it all in her head? Could she be imagining things? The feeling gnawed at her, creeping into her thoughts and refusing to let go. As the weeks passed, Sarah began to dread these dinners. They felt less like family gatherings and more like a trial she had to survive. She couldn't help but notice the small details. How Martha always made sure to serve her specific dishes, how Mark never seemed to ask if she was okay, and how the sickness always hit her right after dinner and no one else. But still, she kept quiet. She was the outsider here, after all, and she didn't want to cause unnecessary drama. She'd heard enough stories about daughters-in-law causing rifts in families. Sarah wasn't going to be one of those women. Yet, the more she tried to ignore it, the more her body rebelled. The sickness wouldn't go away. Something was wrong, she knew it in her gut. And as much as she wanted to trust Martha's outward kindness, something about her mother-in-law's actions just didn't add up. The sickness wasn't just occasional anymore, it had become a pattern. Sarah couldn't ignore it any longer. Every single time she sat down to dinner with Mark's family, her body reacted like it was rejecting something. The nausea turned to dizziness, her head pounding like a drum after each meal. But still, she was the only one who seemed affected. No one else complained. Mark was perfectly fine, oblivious even, as he scarfed down his plate like it was the best thing he'd ever eaten. Martha's cooking was, after all, legendary in the family. Sarah's mind began to race. Was it possible? Could something be wrong with the food? No, that couldn't be it. Everyone else was eating the same dishes, and they were fine. But the nagging feeling wouldn't leave her. It clung to her thoughts, making her question everything she tried to dismiss as just stress or a weak stomach. She started paying closer attention, observing quietly at the dinner table. Each night, Martha seemed to make an extra effort with her food, insisting that Sarah try the special dishes she'd made. Just for her. There was always something different on Sarah's plate, slightly more sauce, an extra garnish, or a different side dish. And Martha was always watching, smiling sweetly whenever Sarah took a bite. A smile that, the more Sarah thought about it, seemed too deliberate, too fixed. The turning point came when Sarah decided to skip dinner altogether one night, pretending she wasn't feeling well. She stayed upstairs, listening to the sounds of laughter and chatter from the dining room below. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel sick. No nausea, no headaches. Just peace. It was as if her body had been given a chance to recover. That night, lying in bed next to a blissfully unaware Mark, her mind began to spin. It wasn't the food. It couldn't be. Or could it? Sarah's suspicion turned to dread. The next few days were a blur of conflicting thoughts. Could Martha really be doing something to the food? It seemed impossible, absurd even. This was her mother-in-law, the woman who had welcomed her with open arms. But then again, had she really? The more Sarah thought about it, the more she noticed the subtle jabs, the way Martha always seemed to be just a little too involved in their marriage, always at Mark's side, whispering in his ear. She'd dismissed it as motherly concern before, but now she wasn't so sure. Sarah decided to test her theory. At the next family dinner, she sat down with a forced smile, determined to observe everything. She didn't eat much, pushing her food around the plate, taking small bites here and there. Martha, as expected, was watching her closely, offering seconds, urging her to try the dishes she'd prepared especially for her. "Come on, Sarah, you hardly touched your food," Martha said, her voice dripping with sweetness. "I'm just not that hungry tonight," Sarah replied, forcing a smile. But her mind was racing. What if she was right? What if Martha was doing something to the food? As dinner wrapped up, Sarah felt fine, no nausea, no dizziness. But she didn't let herself get too hopeful. It could have been a coincidence. One dinner wasn't enough to prove anything. She needed more time, more chances to observe without arousing suspicion. Over the next week, she carefully avoided the dishes that Martha seemed most eager for her to eat, and sure enough, her symptoms lessened. But every time she did eat, even a small amount of Martha's food, the sickness came roaring back. The more Sarah avoided the food, the more distant Mark became. He'd always been busy with work, but now he seemed completely disconnected from her. Whenever she mentioned feeling sick, he brushed it off, too wrapped up in his mother's version of reality to consider anything else. "She means well, Sarah," he'd say, dismissing her concerns with a wave. "You're just stressed." Stressed. That word was starting to sound like an accusation, as if her own husband believed she was overreacting, imagining things. And why wouldn't he? Martha had him wrapped around her finger. Sarah could see it now. Her mother-in-law's carefully curated sweetness masked something darker, something controlling. The woman had a way of making Sarah feel small, insignificant, while playing the perfect, loving mother to Mark. Sarah started to feel like she was losing her grip on reality. She couldn't trust anyone, not even her own husband. Every interaction with Martha felt like a game, a twisted dance where Sarah was always one step behind, trying to catch up but never quite making it. And Martha's smile, oh, that smile, became more sinister with every passing day. But Sarah wasn't ready to confront her yet. She needed more proof, something undeniable. She couldn't just accuse Martha without solid evidence, not when Mark was already so defensive of his mother. And so, Sarah played along, pretending everything was fine, all the while quietly planning her next move. Martha, it seemed, had underestimated her. Sarah decided she couldn't live like this anymore. The constant dread that accompanied every meal was eating away at her, no pun intended. She had to find out the truth, no matter how painful or terrifying it might be. If Martha was poisoning her, she couldn't just sit back and do nothing. But she also couldn't go to Mark with half-baked suspicions. He would never believe her. Not without proof. The next family dinner, Sarah made sure to be fully prepared. She slipped a small plastic bag into her purse, barely big enough to hold a few spoonfuls of food. When Martha wasn't looking, Sarah discreetly scooped a sample of her meal into the bag, making sure to take only from the portions Martha had served her directly. Her heart raced the entire time. It was a delicate dance, pretending to be a part of the jovial dinner conversation, while her mind was working overtime, calculating every move. After the meal, Sarah excused herself, pretending to feel unwell, something that no longer surprised anyone. She slipped out of the house under the pretense of needing fresh air and drove straight to a nearby lab. She didn't care how much it cost, she needed answers. The technician was puzzled but professional. Sarah handed over the food sample, her hands trembling slightly as she filled out the paperwork. "Testing for toxins," she wrote. It felt surreal, like she was living out someone else's nightmare. The next few days were agonizing. Sarah tried to act normal around Mark and Martha, keeping up appearances while her thoughts ran wild. What would she do if the test came back positive? Could she really confront Martha, knowing how much Mark adored her? Worse, what if the test came back clean? Would that mean she had been wrong all along, that it was all just in her head? The waiting drove her to the edge of sanity, and the tension between her and Mark grew thicker by the day. When the results finally came in, Sarah's heart sank. The technician confirmed traces of harmful substances in the food sample. The substance was subtle, not enough to cause immediate or dramatic symptoms, but it could explain the chronic nausea, headaches, and fatigue she'd been experiencing. It was slow and insidious, designed to cause harm over time without being easily detected. Sarah felt her stomach twist, not from illness this time, but from sheer disbelief. It was real. Martha was poisoning her. The revelation hit her like a truck. She wanted to scream, to storm into the dining room and demand answers, but she knew that wouldn't get her anywhere. No one would believe her, least of all Mark. Martha had been too careful, too subtle, and Sarah had been too isolated. She could see it all now, the manipulation, the quiet control Martha exerted over every aspect of Mark's life, including his marriage. And Mark, too blind or too loyal, couldn't see any of it. But Sarah wasn't about to be the silent victim anymore. She had proof, and that meant she had power. She knew better than to accuse Martha outright without a plan. She needed more than just a lab report. She needed undeniable evidence that would not only reveal Martha's treachery but also show Mark the truth, once and for all. In the days that followed, Sarah played along with the family routine, pretending nothing had changed. She acted like the same compliant daughter-in-law, smiling at Martha's passive-aggressive remarks and enduring the cold indifference from Mark, all while quietly preparing her next move. She began recording their conversations during meals, using a small voice recorder she had hidden in her purse. Sarah knew that if Martha had been bold enough to poison her, she would eventually slip up in conversation, especially if Sarah could nudge her just right. The hardest part was keeping her emotions in check. Each dinner became a high-stakes game, one where she had to remain calm and composed, even as her body screamed in revolt. But Sarah had the advantage now. She knew what Martha was capable of, and that knowledge gave her strength. Mark, however, was becoming more distant. Every time Sarah tried to bring up her suspicions, he dismissed them. He couldn't fathom that his beloved mother could do something so malicious. And that's when Sarah realized, Mark wasn't just blind, he was under his mother's thumb. Martha had been manipulating him for years, quietly turning him against Sarah, making her seem irrational, paranoid, and ungrateful. Sarah saw it clearly now, the way Martha would slip in little comments about Sarah's behavior, planting seeds of doubt in Mark's mind, all while maintaining her image as the caring, nurturing mother. It was a twisted web, and Sarah was starting to see every thread. But knowing wasn't enough. She needed Mark to see it too. One evening, during another tense family dinner, Sarah noticed a familiar shift in Martha's demeanor. Martha had started pushing a particular dish toward Sarah again, insisting she try it. "It's your favorite, isn't it?" Martha asked, her voice dripping with false warmth. Sarah smiled politely but didn't touch the food. Instead, she engaged Martha in conversation, subtly steering the discussion toward health and wellness. It was a careful dance, weaving in comments about how she had been feeling better lately, almost as if something in her routine had changed for the better. Sarah watched Martha's reaction closely, waiting for a crack to appear in her carefully constructed facade. Martha smiled tightly, her eyes narrowing just for a split second. It was the moment Sarah had been waiting for. Without missing a beat, she continued talking, dropping hints about visiting the doctor and running tests. Martha's smile wavered, just enough for Sarah to catch it. Sarah leaned back in her chair, feeling a surge of quiet satisfaction. She didn't need Martha to admit anything just yet. She already had what she needed: the poison, the lab results, and now the subtle confirmation that she wasn't imagining things. Sarah knew she was close. She had enough proof to take action, but if she confronted Martha too soon, she could lose everything. Martha had been too careful for too long, and Sarah needed her to slip up, just once, in a way that couldn't be denied. That's when she came up with a plan, a way to make Martha reveal her true nature in front of the one person who still didn't believe her, Mark. The next dinner was going to be different. Sarah had thought it through, carefully laying the groundwork in the days leading up to it. She dropped casual mentions about feeling better, about how she'd started eating more carefully, avoiding certain foods. And each time, she watched Martha's face tighten just slightly, her eyes narrowing for a brief moment before she recovered her mask of sweetness. But there was something there, something Sarah knew she could exploit. At dinner, Sarah played her part perfectly. She laughed along with the family, engaged in small talk, and made sure to eat just enough to avoid suspicion. But this time, she had a small voice recorder hidden in her lap, tucked under the tablecloth. It was a risk, but she needed something Martha couldn't deny, something Mark couldn't dismiss as paranoia. As they ate, Sarah steered the conversation toward the subtle topic of health again, gently nudging Martha into familiar territory. "You know, I've been feeling so much better lately," Sarah said with a casual smile. "It's funny how small changes can make such a big difference." Martha's eyes flicked to her, the faintest glint of something cold in her gaze. "Oh? What kind of changes, dear?" she asked, her voice saccharine sweet. "Well," Sarah continued, "I've been more mindful of what I eat, especially at dinner. It seems like avoiding certain foods has really helped." She let the words hang in the air, watching as Martha's expression tightened ever so slightly. Martha hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. "I see," she said slowly, her voice still coated in false concern. "You should be careful with your diet, Sarah. Sometimes, people don't realize how sensitive they can be to certain things." Sarah smiled, keeping her tone light. "Oh, I'm sure you're right. It's amazing how little things can affect your health in such a big way." Mark, oblivious as ever, continued eating, barely registering the exchange. But Sarah wasn't finished. She needed to push Martha just a little further, to see if she could get her to slip. "You know," Sarah added, her tone as nonchalant as possible, "I've even been considering having some of the food tested, just to be sure I'm not allergic to anything. Better safe than sorry, right?" There it was, a flicker in Martha's eyes, a tightening of her grip on her fork. It was subtle, but Sarah caught it. Martha recovered quickly, smiling that same too-sweet smile, but Sarah knew she'd struck a nerve. "I don't think that's necessary, dear," Martha said, her voice smooth but with a slight edge. "After all, we've been eating the same meals for years, and no one else has had any issues." Sarah didn't press the point, but she didn't need to. The seed had been planted, and she could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface. Martha was rattled, even if she wouldn't show it. After dinner, as the family moved to the living room for coffee, Sarah excused herself, pretending she wasn't feeling well again. But this time, she didn't leave the room. Instead, she lingered just out of sight, near the hallway where she could hear the conversation that followed. Martha's voice floated out, quiet and controlled. "I don't know what's gotten into Sarah lately. she said softly, as if confiding in Mark. She's been so paranoid about her health. I'm starting to worry she might be imagining things. Mark sighed, his voice tired. She's been under a lot of stress, Mom. I'm sure it's nothing. There it was, Martha's manipulation, working its way into Mark's mind like a poison of its own. Sarah clenched her fists, knowing how hard it would be to break through that wall of doubt Martha had built between them. But Sarah wasn't backing down. She had the evidence, and soon she would have the final piece to bring it all crashing down. The next day, Sarah made her move. She called Mark at work, her voice calm but insistent. I need you to come home early tonight, she said. There's something I need to show you. It's important. Mark sounded confused, but he agreed, and Sarah spent the rest of the day preparing. When he arrived, she was ready. She sat him down at the kitchen table, her heart pounding but her mind clear. This was it. No more games, no more pretending. Mark, she began, looking him directly in the eyes. I need you to listen to me, and I need you to trust me. I've been sick for weeks, and it's not just in my head. I've been keeping quiet because I didn't want to believe it myself, but I can't ignore it anymore. Mark frowned, clearly uncomfortable. Sarah, what are you talking about? She took a deep breath and pulled out the lab results she had gotten from the food sample, sliding the paper across the table toward him. I had the food tested, she said, her voice steady. There are toxins in it, Mark. Someone has been poisoning me. Mark's face went pale as he scanned the paper, his disbelief turning to horror. What are you saying? I'm saying your mother has been poisoning me, Sarah said, her voice firm. I know it sounds crazy, but I've been watching her. She's been slipping something into my food at every dinner, and I have the lab results to prove it. Mark stared at the paper, his mind struggling to process what he was reading. He shook his head slowly, as if refusing to believe it. This can't be right. Mom wouldn't. She would. Sarah cut him off, her voice sharp. And she has. I've recorded our conversations, Mark. I have everything I need to prove it. Mark's hands trembled as he looked up at her, the weight of the truth finally starting to sink in. Sarah, I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Sarah replied, her voice softening. But you do have to believe me. We need to confront her together. You need to see this for yourself. Mark swallowed hard, his eyes filled with a mix of guilt, fear, and realization. Okay, he whispered. Okay. That evening, Sarah and Mark sat down with Martha in the living room. The air was thick with tension, and the usual warmth of the house felt cold, oppressive. Martha, oblivious to what was coming, smiled at them both as if everything was as it had always been. Sarah could feel Mark's nerves, the way his hands gripped the edge of the couch, how his leg twitched with anxiety. She knew this was as much a betrayal to him as it was an attack on her, but it had to be done. The truth had to come out. Martha, Sarah started, her voice steady but firm. We need to talk. Martha's smile faltered slightly, a hint of confusion in her eyes. Of course, dear. What's going on? You both look so serious. Sarah exchanged a quick glance with Mark, whose face was pale, but he nodded at her to continue. I've been sick for weeks, Sarah said, her gaze fixed on Martha's face. But it's not because of stress or anything I've done wrong. It's because of something in the food. And I have proof. For the first time, Martha's expression cracked. It was subtle, a flicker of something darker in her eyes, but she recovered quickly. What are you talking about, Sarah? She asked, her voice laced with confusion. That's ridiculous. You've just been under pressure, adjusting to married life. That's all. Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out the lab results, placing them carefully on the coffee table in front of Martha. This says otherwise, she said. I had the food tested. There are toxins in it. I've been poisoned, and you're the only one who's been preparing my food. Martha stared at the paper for a long moment, her face unreadable. Mark was watching her closely now, his knuckles white as he gripped the arm of the couch. The room was filled with an unbearable silence, thick with unspoken accusations. Then, slowly, Martha leaned back in her chair, her smile returning, but this time, it was cold, calculated. "Oh, Sarah," she said, almost laughing. "Is that what you think? That I would do something so cruel? You poor thing. I knew you were feeling unwell, but I never imagined your mind would take you to such a place." The words were meant to sound caring, but Sarah could hear the venom underneath. She had expected this. Martha was too smart to admit anything outright. But Sarah had come prepared. "I've been recording our conversations," she said calmly, her eyes never leaving Martha's. "I have hours of you talking about my health, how you've been concerned, how I've changed. You've been gaslighting me, and now I have the evidence to prove it." Martha's face froze for a moment, her mask of concern cracking. She quickly regained her composure, but Sarah had seen it, the fear, the realization that her control was slipping. "Mark," Martha said, turning to her son, her voice softening into something more motherly. "You can't believe this, can you? Sarah's obviously been going through a rough time, and now she's making wild accusations. You know me. You know I would never hurt her or anyone. I've only ever wanted to help." Mark didn't answer right away. His face was conflicted, torn between the woman who raised him and the wife he promised to protect. Sarah watched as he struggled, his gaze shifting from Martha to the lab results to Sarah. It was clear he wanted to believe his mother. After all, she had been his anchor his entire life. But now, faced with undeniable proof, that belief was crumbling, and Sarah could see it in his eyes. "Martha," he began, his voice shaking slightly, I don't know what to believe anymore." That hit harder than Sarah expected. Mark had always been so confident, so sure of his mother's love and intentions. Seeing him like this, doubtful, vulnerable, made the moment even more surreal. Martha's expression softened into one of concern, her voice dripping with honey as she tried one last time to regain control. "Oh, Mark, sweetie, you're confused. This is all just a misunderstanding. Sarah's been under so much stress, and it's affecting her judgment. We'll get through this, just like we always do. But you have to trust me. I would never harm her. You know that." But Mark wasn't buying it, not anymore. Sarah could see the shift happening, the slow realization that maybe, just maybe, everything wasn't as it seemed. He turned to Sarah, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was understanding in his eyes. "Mom," he said quietly, "I need you to be honest with me." Martha's eyes widened slightly, her carefully constructed facade slipping further. "Mark, I am being honest," she insisted, her voice rising slightly in pitch. "I've done nothing wrong. This is all just a horrible mistake. You have to believe me." But Mark didn't reply. He just sat there, staring at her with a mixture of disbelief and sadness. The room fell silent again, the weight of the truth hanging in the air like a leaden cloud. Sarah knew this was her moment. She leaned forward, her voice calm but unyielding. "Mark, I know this is hard. But I need you to see what's been happening. Your mother has been poisoning me, and I have the proof. She's been trying to manipulate both of us, turning you against me slowly. You may not have noticed it before, but I need you to trust me now. We can't let this continue." Martha's calm demeanor finally shattered. "Enough!" she snapped, her voice laced with fury. "This is absurd. How dare you accuse me of such vile things, after everything I've done for you?" Sarah didn't flinch. She had been expecting this. "Martha, we both know the truth. You can keep denying it, but I have the evidence. And I'm not afraid to use it." Mark, stunned by the outburst, sat back, his eyes darting between the two women in his life. He looked at his mother, the woman who had always been his protector, and then at his wife, who had been quietly suffering under his roof. The truth, once so distant, was now glaringly obvious. "Mom," he said softly, his voice breaking, I think you need to leave." Martha's face twisted in shock, her hands trembling slightly as she stood up. "Mark, no," she whispered. "You can't do this to me. I'm your mother. I know, he said, his voice steady now. But I can't let you hurt Sarah anymore. This has to stop. Martha stared at him for a long moment, her eyes wide with disbelief, before she turned and walked out of the room, her footsteps heavy on the hardwood floor. The door slammed behind her, leaving a deafening silence in her wake. Mark sat there, staring at the empty space where his mother had just stood. Sarah reached out, placing her hand gently on his. He didn't pull away, but he didn't look at her either. The weight of what had just happened hung between them, heavy and unspoken. "Thank you?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark nodded, but the words didn't come. They both knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for now, the truth had finally been set free, and that was the first step toward healing. The house was quiet now. Too quiet. The kind of silence that wasn't peaceful but heavy, like the calm after a storm when the damage hadn't been fully assessed yet. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded in her lap, trying to make sense of everything that had just unfolded. Martha was gone, but the echoes of her presence still lingered in every corner of the room. It didn't feel like a victory, more like an uneasy truce with the truth. Mark hadn't said much after his mother left. He was upstairs now, likely processing what had just happened, trying to reconcile the image of his caring mother with the woman who had been slowly poisoning his wife. Sarah couldn't imagine how difficult this was for him, but at the same time, she couldn't ignore what she had been through. The betrayal, the manipulation, the weeks of feeling like she was losing her mind, it all came rushing back in one overwhelming wave. But it wasn't just about what Martha had done. It was about what had been broken between her and Mark. The foundation of their marriage, built on trust and love, had been shaken to its core. Sarah couldn't help but wonder, could they ever go back to the way things were? Could Mark ever look at her without seeing the doubts his mother had planted in his mind? Could she ever look at him without wondering why it had taken him so long to see the truth? She stood up and began to pace the kitchen, her mind racing. The proof was there, undeniable. Martha had poisoned her, and now she was gone. But the damage wasn't just physical, it was emotional, psychological. And Sarah wasn't sure how to begin healing from that. It wasn't just Martha who had betrayed her. Mark, in his own way, had too. His blindness to the manipulation had left Sarah feeling alone, vulnerable, and mistrustful. Footsteps creaked on the stairs, and Mark appeared in the doorway. His face was pale, and he looked exhausted, like the weight of what had just happened was finally sinking in. He walked over to the table and sat down, not looking at Sarah at first. The silence between them stretched on, thick and suffocating. Finally Mark spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know where to start." Sarah didn't say anything. She wasn't sure what he could say that would fix things. The truth was out, but it didn't automatically heal the wounds. There were still so many things left unspoken between them, and the gap that had formed over the past few months wasn't going to close overnight. "I should have seen it," Mark continued, his voice cracking. "I should have believed you sooner. I didn't want to believe she could do something like this." Sarah nodded slowly, her heart heavy. "I understand, Mark. She's your mother. It's hard to see someone you love in a different light, especially when they've been manipulating you for so long." Mark winced at the word. Manipulating. But he didn't argue. He couldn't. The evidence was there, clear as day. His mother had poisoned Sarah, and in doing so, had nearly destroyed their marriage. The realization hit him hard, and he slumped in his chair, burying his face in his hands. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice muffled by his hands. "I should have protected you." Sarah felt a pang in her chest. She had wanted to hear those words, but now that they were spoken, they didn't bring the comfort she thought they would. The apology was genuine, but it didn't erase the pain of the last few weeks. It didn't erase the nights she spent sick and confused, the times she had doubted herself, or the moments when she had felt completely alone. "Mark," Sarah began, choosing her words carefully, "I know you didn't mean for any of this to happen. And I don't blame you for wanting to believe the best in your mother. But this isn't just about what she did. It's about what we didn't do, about the way we let things get this bad. Mark looked up, his eyes filled with guilt and shame. I know, he said quietly. I've been distant. I let her come between us. I let her poison more than just the food. She poisoned our relationship. Sarah swallowed hard. And that's what we need to focus on now. She's gone, but the damage isn't. We need to figure out how to move forward, if we can move forward. Mark's face crumpled, and for the first time, Sarah saw how deeply this had affected him. He had lost more than just his image of his mother. He had lost the safety net he thought his family provided, and now he was realizing just how much he had taken their relationship for granted. I want to fix this, Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how, but I'll do whatever it takes. Sarah wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that they could rebuild, that this wasn't the end of their marriage. But a part of her still held back, uncertain. Trust was fragile, and once broken, it wasn't easily mended. I need time, she said softly. I need time to process everything, to heal. I can't just pretend everything is okay because it's not. Mark nodded, his eyes filling with tears. I understand. I don't want to lose you. Sarah's heart ached at the raw emotion in his voice, but she knew that words alone wouldn't fix this. It would take time, effort, and a lot of hard conversations. And even then, there were no guarantees. She wasn't sure if they could ever get back to the way things were, but for now, she was willing to try, slowly, carefully. We'll take it one step at a time, she said gently. But it's going to take a lot of work. Mark wiped his eyes, nodding. I'll do whatever it takes. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of everything they had been through pressing down on them. It wasn't the kind of silence they had shared before, the comfortable kind that came with familiarity and love. This was different, filled with unspoken pain and uncertainty. But maybe, just maybe, it was also filled with the faintest possibility of healing. As Sarah sat there, watching Mark wrestle with his emotions, she realized that the path forward wasn't clear. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't guaranteed. But they had survived the worst of it, the lies, the manipulation, the poison. Now it was up to them to decide what came next. Martha's influence was gone, but the scars remained. And it would be a long time before those scars faded, if they ever did. But for the first time in weeks, Sarah felt something close to hope. Not because everything was fixed, but because they had finally faced the truth, and sometimes, that's the hardest step of all. The next steps wouldn't be easy, but at least now they were facing them together.